Welcome back everyone to another deep dive into the wild world of the Sega Genesis. A console that didn't just play games, it threw punches in the 90s console wars with a swagger that screamed, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." The Sega Genesis wasn't afraid to take risks, and that's what made it a legend, a rebel in a world ruled by Nintendo's family-friendly empire. But with risk comes chaos, and these 10 games we're about to explore showcase just how wild things could get on Sega's turf. So let's get started with 10 more controversial Sega Genesis games. Double Dragon. Double Dragon punched its way onto the Sega Genesis in 1992, and it aimed to bring the arcade beat-em-up legend to the 16-bit stage, but instead it landed a haymaker of controversy that left fans reeling. Developed by Accolade under the license from Technos Japan, this port promised to recapture the gritty street fighting saga of Billy and Jimmy Lee, duking it out against thugs to rescue Marion, with bone-crunching combos and raw attitude. But unlike the Genesis' reputation for delivering arcade-perfect thrills, Double Dragon stumbled hard with its sluggish controls, choppy animation, and a stripped-down experience that felt like a shadow of its coin-op glory. This drastic downgrade from the arcade and even the NES version clashed with Sega's bold, edgy image, sparking debates over whether the game was a lazy cash grab, unworthy of the Double Dragon name. Adding to the mess, the Genesis version slashed the two-player co-op mode, a cornerstone of the series, down to a buggy, single-player slog with an alternating multiplayer option that frustrated fans who grew up pounding Punk side by side. Players and critics alike questioned how a console touting blast processing could botch a beloved classic so badly, turning a street-tough icon into a punching bag for disappointment. Beyond its technical knockout, Double Dragon on the Genesis tapped into a larger brawl about the quality of arcade ports and the growing pains of the 16-bit era, where expectations were sky-high and competition was fierce. Fans and reviewers slammed its horrible controls and washed-out graphics, arguing it betrayed the series' legacy of fast-paced, co-op chaos with a port so sloppy it felt like a back-alley ripoff. Some grumbled that its violent punches and kicks, while tame compared to Mortal Kombat, still sat awkwardly on a console pushing into living rooms dominated by younger players, though the real heat came from its execution, not its content. The controversy never hit a fever pitch of blood-soaked censorship debates, but it underscored a tension between Sega's promise of arcade-grade action and the reality of rushed subpar adaptations. Despite the flack, Double Dragon limped on as a curious artifact, proof that even a Genesis brawler could stumble, leaving fans nostalgic for an arcade glory it couldn't deliver. Slaughter Sport. Slaughter Sport smashed onto the Sega Genesis in 1990, landing a messy mix of ambition and controversy that left players dazed. Developed by Razorsoft, this bare-knuckle brawler tried to carve out a niche in the fighting game craze, with a cast of freakish combatants duking it out in a no-holds-barred tournament, drenched in cartoonish gore. Unlike the Genesis' polished heavyweights like Streets of Rage, Slaughter Sport leaned into the crude, over-the-top vibe with oozing blood, severed limbs, and a tone so juvenile it felt like a rebellious kid doodling in the margins of Sega's slick catalog. This jarring contrast to the console's growing reputation for accessible, high-octane fun sparked debates about whether its tasteless violence and toilet humor were too much, or just too dumb for Sega's audience. Adding to the chaos, the game's clunky controls and glitchy mechanics made every fight a slog, fueling outrage among players who saw it as a shameless knockoff of arcade giants like Street Fighter II, but without the finesse. Critics and fans alike questioned how this bloody, bizarre mess made it to shelves, turning a would-be contender into a punching bag for mockery. Beyond its gory guts, Slaughter Sport stepped into a bigger arena of contention about the limits of violence and the quality in the early 1990s gaming boom, where Sega was battling to out-edge Nintendo. The Genesis era was already buzzing with brutal brawlers, but Slaughter Sport stirred its own pot with a mix of graphic excess and sheer incompetence that felt like a parody gone wrong. Reviewers trashed its poor play mechanics and repulsive aesthetic, arguing it pushed gore past the entertainment into cringe territory. Some worried its splatterfest visuals and crude quips might desensitize young players or just embarrass the industry at a time when gaming faced scrutiny from watchdogs. It highlighted a tension between Sega's bold, anything-goes ethos and the risk of churning out low-rent shockers that alienated more than they thrilled. Despite the backlash, Slaughter Sport clawed its way into obscurity as a cult curiosity, proof that even a Genesis misfire could leave a bloody footprint, if only as a cautionary tale. Sword of Sodan. Sword of Sodan slashed its way onto the Sega Genesis in 1991, developed by Discovery Software and ported from the Amiga by Enterprise. This side-scrolling hack-and-slash promised a brutal fantasy epic, pitting siblings Brodan and Shardan against a dark sorcerer with oversized swords and blood-soaked battles. Unlike the Genesis' polished action gems like Golden Axe, Sword of Sodan staggered in with clunky controls, awkward hit detection, and choppy graphics, complete with gory decapitations and spurting wounds that turn heads for all the wrong reasons. This raw, unpolished violence clashed with Sega's growing reputation as a slick contender in the console wars, sparking debates about whether its over-the-top carnage was too gruesome or just too sloppy for the Genesis audience. Adding to the uproar, the game's punishing difficulty and glitchy mechanics frustrated players who expected Sega's 16-bit power to deliver more than a gore-drenched slog. Fans and reviewers questioned how this messy port made it past quality control, turning a would-be warrior's tale into a cautionary misadventure. Beyond its bloody blunders, Sword of Sodan stumbled into a broader clash about violence and quality in the early 90s gaming scene, where Sega was carving out its rebel identity against Nintendo's safer shores. The Genesis was riding high on gritty hits like Altered Beast, but Sword of Sodan pushed the envelope with graphic dismemberments and a grim tone that echoed the era's fascination with edgy content. Critics trashed its poor controls and unappealing visuals, arguing it took gore past thrilling into gratuitous territory, raising eyebrows among parents already wary of gaming's darker turn. Some feared its visceral combat might desensitize younger players, though the real heat came from its shoddy execution, not just its body count. The controversy never hit the fever pitch of the fatality-fueled Senate hearings, but it exposed the tension between Sega's bold, boundary-pushing ethos and the risk of churning out half-baked bloodbaths that alienated more than they impressed. Despite the flack, Sword of Sodan carved a niche as a cult oddity, a gory, glitchy relic that proved even the Genesis blast processing couldn't polish every sword-swinging disaster. Captain Planet and the Planeteers. Captain Planet swooped onto the Sega Genesis in 1992, and it aimed to harness the eco-friendly power of the hit cartoon. But instead, it crash-landed into a whirlwind of controversy that left fans and critics scratching their head. Developed by Nova Logic and published by Sega, this side-scrolling action game put players in the shoes of the Planeteers, battling polluters with their elemental rings, all while summoning Captain Planet himself to clean up the mess. Captain Planet stumbled with clunky controls, repetitive missions, and graphics so bland they barely captured the show's vibrant spirit. This stark contrast to Sega's reputation for fast, polished fun sparked debates about whether the game was too dull and broken to honor its eco-warrior source material. A letdown for fans expecting a green-powered thrill ride. Adding to the chaos, the game's punishing difficulty and glitchy hit detection frustrated players. While its kid-friendly premise clashed with moments of surprising violence, like blasting animals mutated by toxic waste, parents and players alike questioned how a tie-in preaching environmentalism could feel so lifeless, turning a heroic crusade into a recycling bin of disappointment. Beyond its eco-flops, Captain Planet and the Planeteers rolled into a larger scrap about the quality of licensed games and Sega's knack for cashing in on pop culture in the early 90s. But this game landed just as the industry grappled with a flood of subpar adaptations that often traded on name recognition over gameplay. Critics slammed its boring levels and sloppy mechanics, arguing it butchered a beloved show's message with a port so uninspired it felt like a corporate greenwashing in cartridge form. Some fans worried its mix of preachy eco-lessons and awkward combat might confuse younger players about violence versus virtue, though the real heat came from its failure to deliver fun over sanctimony. But Sega's bold ambition and the risk of churning out rushed, half-hearted cash-ins left players feeling cold. Despite the flack, Captain Planet limped on as a quirky relic, proof that even a Genesis game with a heart of gold could wilt under the weight of its own lofty ideals. The Ooze. The Ooze slithered onto the Sega Genesis in 1995, developed by Sega Technical Institute. This quirky action game cast you as a scientist turned into toxic slime, oozing through levels to exact revenge on a shady corporation with gooey attacks and grotesque melting aesthetics. The Ooze embraced a bizarre, unsettling vibe that was a stark contrast to the console's mainstream appeal. Adding to the mess, the game's sluggish controls and punishing difficulty drove players nuts, while its dark premise and chemical mutation and revenge raised eyebrows among parents expecting lighter 16-bit adventures. Critics and fans questioned if this slimy oddball was a bold experiment gone wrong or a misfit that oozed past Sega's quality checkpoints. Beyond its gooey guts, the Ooze slid into a bigger debate about experimental games and Sega's risk-taking in the mid-90s. The era was buzzing with violent hits like Mortal Kombat, but the Ooze stirred its own pot with a mix of graphic slime splattering and sheer obscurity that felt out of step with the industry's shift toward 3D polish. Some worried its grotesque melting mechanics and toxic waste backstory might disturb younger players, though the real heat came from its clunky execution, not moral panic. The Ooze highlighted a tension between Sega's legacy of edgy innovation and the gamble of unleashing unpolished oddities that baffled more than they bewitched. Despite the flack, the Ooze solidified a cult following, a sticky, slimy testament that even a Genesis misadventure could leave a mark, if only as a quirky, cautionary drip. Before we move on with our list, I'd love to know what you think so far. Sound off in the comments below if you're enjoying this video. And while you're down there, be sure to hit the like button. It helps out more than you know. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Okay, back to the list. Streets of Rage 3. Streets of Rage 3 stomped to the Sega Genesis in 1994, and it sparked a brawl of controversy that left fans of the beloved beat-em-up series divided and fuming. Developed by Sega, this sequel brought back Axel, Blaze, and Skate, now joined by the cyborg Dr. Zan, to clean up Wood Oak City, with bone-crunching combos against a syndicate planting bombs and unleashing chaos. Unlike the Genesis' early Streets of Rage entry, which balanced gritty fun with tight gameplay, this third outing cranked up the difficulty to brutal levels, swapped out fan-favorite characters like Max for oddballs like Zan, and draped the story in a darker, more complex plot involving robotic doubles and nuclear threats. This stark shift from the series' straightforward arcade-style roots clashed with Sega's reputation for delivering accessible brawlers, igniting debates over whether the game had strayed too far from its punchy origins. Adding fuel to the fire, the North American version got a heavy-handed localization, amping up censorship by toning down violence and tweaking costumes, like Blaze's skirt, and rewriting dialogue into a messier narrative, leaving players questioning why Sega would meddle with a formula fans adored. Critics and loyalists alike wondered if the harder-edged, less familiar sequel was a bold evolution or a betrayal of the streets they'd fought to reclaim. Beyond its design shakeup, Streets of Rage 3 rolled into a larger scrap about violence and cultural shifts in gaming during the mid-90s. The Genesis was no stranger to brawlers, but this entry landed as the industry faced growing scrutiny over violent content. The game's amped-up combat, featuring new moves like Axel's fiery spin kicks and enemies exploding into goo, paired with its dystopian stakes, stirred unease among some who saw it pushing the Genesis past gritty fun into darker territory. Even if it never hit Mortal Kombat gore levels, critics griped about its unfair difficulty and jarring changes, arguing it risked alienating the series' core crowd with mechanics and story tweaks that felt more punishing than polished. The localization cuts only fanned the flames, hinting at Sega bowing to pressure while still fumbling the execution. The controversy never sparked Senate-level outrage, but it exposed the tension between Sega's knack for bold sequels and the pitfalls of overhauling a fan favorite without losing its soul. Chakan the Forever Man. Chakan the Forever Man sliced onto the Sega Genesis in 1992, and it plunged into a cauldron of controversy that left players both intrigued and infuriated. Developed by Sega and Extended Play Productions, this dark action platformer cast you as Chakan, a cursed warrior doomed to hunt supernatural evils across nightmarish realms, armed with dual blades and an arsenal of alchemical tricks. Chakan embraced a grim gothic tone, blood-drenched demons, and a brooding hero straight out of a horror comic, clashing hard with Sega's reputation for fast, colorful fun. This stark contrast sparked debates about whether its bleak violence and macabre vibe were too intense for the console's younger audience, especially with its graphic death animations and eerie soundtrack that felt more like a midnight fright fest than a typical 16-bit romp. Adding to the storm, the game's brutal difficulty, unforgiving platforming, relentless enemies, and a convoluted level structure drove players to despair, while its mature themes of eternal damnation raised eyebrows among parents expecting lighter fare. Critics and fans questioned if the shadowy, gore-soaked oddity was a daring misstep or a twisted gem that Sega let slip through the cracks. Beyond its dark tone, Chakan the Forever Man launched into a broader clash about violence and ambition in the early 90s gaming scene. The Genesis was riding high, but Chakan arrived as the industry faced growing heat over violent content. Its visceral combat, paired with a haunting narrative of a man battling his own curse, fueled whispers that it pushed the Genesis past edgy thrills into unsettling territory. Reviews slammed its frustrating difficulty and creepy overkill, arguing it blurred the line between atmospheric adventure and punishing excess in a way that could overwhelm players. Some worried its grotesque visuals and fatalistic story might spook or desensitize younger fans, though the real uproar came from its clunky execution, awkward controls, and disjointed flow that felt unpolished for Sega standards. Dark Castle. Dark Castle crept onto the Sega Genesis in 1991, tumbling into a dungeon of controversy that left players bewildered and betrayed. Developed by Silicon Beach Software and ported by Electronic Arts from its earlier PC and Mac versions, this platformer thrusts you into the boots of a brave adventurer storming a gothic fortress to topple an evil black knight, armed with rocks and a shaky shield. Dark Castle lurched in with clunky controls, awkward animations, and graphics so muddy they barely echoed the moody charm of its monochrome origins. This stark contrast to Sega's reputation for slick, fast-paced fun sparked debates about whether this botched port was too broken to deserve a spot on the 16-bit stage. A slap in the face to fans expecting Genesis-grade quality. Adding to the uproar, the game's punishing difficulty, like traps that killed instantly, enemies that swarm relentlessly, and a wonky hit detection system, frustrated players to no end. While its dark, eerie vibe of bats and skeletons clashed with the console's typical, brighter appeal, critics and gamers questioned how this glitchy, grim relic made it past Sega's gates, turning a quirky classic into a castle of disappointment. Beyond its technical collapse, Dark Castle staggered into a broader skirmish about the pitfalls of porting, and Sega's bold but risky 16-bit ambitions, just as the Genesis was carving its niche in the early 90s gaming wars. Dark Castle landed amid a wave of shaky adaptations that tested the limits of fan patience and console potential. Its crude violence stirred unease among parents, echoing the era's growing scrutiny of gaming content, though its real sin was execution, not gore. Reviews slammed its abysmal controls and dated feel, arguing it mangled a cult PC favorite into a joyless slog that could alienate Sega's growing audience, exposing a tension between Sega's knack for bold ports and the danger of unleashing half-baked relics that felt more like cash grabs than tributes. Sonic Spinball. Sonic Spinball rolled onto the Sega Genesis in 1993, and it launched into a storm of controversy that left Sonic fans spinning with mixed emotions. Developed by Sega Technical Institute with help from Polygames, this spin-off traded Sonic's high-speed platforming for a pinball-inspired romp, tasking the blue blur with bouncing through Robotnik's fortress to snag Chaos Emeralds and smash his evil machines. Unlike the Genesis core Sonic titles, which defined Sega with blistering pace and vibrant worlds, Sonic Spinball leaned into a lower physics-driven gimmick, complete with clunky controls and garish visuals. This stark departure from Sonic's signature formula clashed with Sega's reputation as the king of speed, sparking debates about whether this oddball experiment was too far a stretch for the mascot's loyal legion. Adding to the friction, the game's rushed development, cobbled together in mere months to hit holiday shelves, brought glitchy collision detection and a soundtrack with off-key bleeps, fueling outrage among fans who saw it as a cheap cash-in rather than a worthy spin on their speedy hero. Beyond its pitfalls, Sonic Spinball flipped into a broader tussle about franchise spin-offs and Sega's high-stake gamble to keep Sonic king in the early 90s. The era was buzzing with mascot mania, but Sonic Spinball landed as Sega felt pressure to churn out Sonic content fast, riding the wave of Sonic 2's smash success. Its quirky premise stirred unease among some parents with its mild violence and industrial edge, though the real heat came from its sloppy execution, not moral panic. Reviews knocked its frustrating controls and uneven difficulty, arguing it blurred the line between creative risk and rushed disappointment in a way that could alienate Sonic's core crowd. The controversy never hit the fever pitch of blood-soaked censorship wars, but it highlighted a tension between Sega's knack for bold innovation and the risk of spinning a beloved icon into a clunker that misfired more than it soared. Last Battle. Last Battle stormed onto the Sega Genesis in 1989, and it stumbled into a ring of controversy that left players and critics reeling from its audacity and flaws. Developed by Sega as a localized version of the Japanese arcade hit Fist of the North Star, this side-scrolling beat-em-up cast you as Arzak, a muscle-bound warrior pummeling foes in a post-apocalyptic wasteland to rescue his kidnapped love, all with over-the-top kicks and gore-soaked finishers. Last Battle embraced a raw, unfiltered vibe that stood out starkly against Sega's emerging reputation for accessible arcade-style fun. This gritty excess sparked debates about whether its graphic violence was too intense for the console's growing audience, especially as it hit shelves before Sega fully defined its edgy but family-friendly identity. Adding to the chaos, the game's localization stripped away the Fist of the North Star license, swapping iconic characters for generic stand-ins and muddling the story with clunky dialogue, infuriating fans who knew the source material and puzzling newcomers with its disjointed mess. Players and reviewers questioned how this bloody, butchered port made it to the Genesis, turning a martial arts epic into a controversial misfire. Beyond its gory punches, Last Battle charged into a broader fray about violence and adaptation in the late 80s gaming scene, a wild time when Sega was still finding its footing against Nintendo's kid-safe empire. The Genesis was carving out its niche with bold, arcade-inspired titles, but Last Battle landed as the industry began eyeing violent games with unease. Its brutal combat, like heads popping like gory piñatas, paired with stiff controls and repetitive levels, stirred grumblings among parents and critics, trashing its poor playability and excessive bloodshed, arguing it pushed action past thrilling into distasteful territory. Some feared its visceral chaos might unsettle younger players, though the real heat came from its sloppy execution and butchered localization, which blurred the lines between gritty homage and shameless hackjob. Last Battle highlighted a tension between Sega's early appetite for raw, unpolished ports and the need to refine its brand for a wider audience. Despite the flack, Last Battle limped on as a red-stained relic, proving that even the Genesis blast processing couldn't salvage every fist-flying fiasco. When these Sega Genesis games burst onto the scene in the early to mid-90s, they didn't just stick to the script. They plunged into a tempest of controversy that rattled expectations for Sega's 16-bit renegade. Some floundered as shoddy adaptations, mangling beloved classics with sluggish controls and lackluster visuals, while others drenched players in crude violence and over-the-top absurdity that clashed with Sega's reputation for polished thrills. Unlike the console's usual high-speed, crowd-pleasing adventures, several leaned into darker, stranger corners, oozing with grotesque twists or grim gothic vibes that felt alien to the Genesis' typical flair. This sharp detour from Sega's fast-paced, approachable identity ignited debates about whether these outliers were too brutal, too buggy, or simply too out there for the system's core fans. Adding to the storm, Rust release brought glitches, punishing challenges, and jarring shifts in tone, sometimes censoring content, other times stripping away what made their roots iconic, prompting players and critics to question if these were daring misfires or cynical cash-ins. Together they turned Sega's bold edge into a lightning rod for frustration, challenging the very soul of what the Genesis stood for. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. What are your thoughts about the games on this list? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to get a conversation started. If you liked this video, please leave a like. It helps out more than you know. If you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming-related content, including but not limited to controversial games. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.